Welcome back, everyone, to part 4 of our look at the story of the Easter Rising through the eyes of extra history. If you have not seen the first 3 parts of my reaction, the link is in the description as well as the link to the original content. Please make sure to give them a subscribe and check out all of their fantastic history content. They've got a lot of other non-history stuff as well, but I'm a history guy, so that's what I do. Let's go ahead and dive into part 4.
North King Street, Dublin, Ireland, April 26, 1916. Crouched behind captured barricades, a British officer issues the order every soldier dreads. Fix bayonets! His platoon complies, sliding the long blades onto their Lee Enfield rifles. A momentary pause as the soldiers wait, collecting their courage. Charge! Shouting, the British surge over the barricades and up the street. Rifle fire booms from the tall, tightly packed buildings surrounding them and blasts out from a barricaded pub. The officer leading the charge takes a bullet. His men drop, killed or wounded. The attack lasts mere seconds, as without cover, the soldiers are easy targets for the Irish nationalists sheltering behind the street barricades.
I mean, this fits perfectly with the time period, right? This is the middle of World War I, and if anybody knows anything about charging over open ground against entrenched, well-defended opponents, it's the British Army, because they're about to do the same stupid thing at the Somme. Not that the other armies don't do it as well, but this is a time period. They're starting to get away from it, but this is a time period in history where there's an idea called the cult of the offensive. Now, granted, we're not talking about massive armies here. We're talking about small group tactics, but the idea was, in most cases, that it was always better to attack. Even if your opponent was defending in strong position, attacking was always better. And if you were defending, it was better to counterattack as quickly as possible. So, this is the British Army. They think this is a bunch of rebels. How hard could it be? We're just going to charge in there. We're going to deal with them. They're going to figure out pretty quickly that it's not the way to go.
The survivors withdraw. Wasting no time, a few nationalists, desperate to replenish their supplies, leap from cover to grab weapons and ammunition from the slain. And they'll need every round, for blood is now trickling into the gutters of North King Street. And as more men give their lives for the conflict, and more civilians find themselves caught in the crossfire, that trickle soon swells to a torrent. This episode is brought to you by, you, our lovely patrons over at Patreon. To hear about how you can vote on history topics we make shows about, and some pretty neat new stuff in the EC merch store, please stay tuned until after the episode. 2 days after the start of the Easter Rising, British efforts were focused on isolating and crushing small Irish nationalist enclaves that had dug in throughout Dublin's city centre. The Four Courts and neighbouring North King Street, where the British launched their doomed bayonet charge, was one such rebel stronghold. The area was a tangle of slum housing and narrow streets and alleys, a nightmare for any attacker. So the British mostly tried to tunnel through walls, going from one building into the next, rather than risk the open street.
Makes sense.
Nationalists fired from windows and rooftops, or from behind their barricades, some moving from house to house to ensure they kept the element of surprise.
So yesterday we talked about how the British Army had used their 18-inch artillery, and how, or 18-pound artillery, not 18-inch. My goodness, that'd be enormous. They did have shells like that in the Great War, but not here. But we talked about that, and when you're dealing with this kind of a situation where it's guerrilla warfare, where you're dealing with a small, very mobile enemy who's on rooftops and in windows and in buildings, it doesn't take very long if you're an army with superior firepower to say, you know what, forget this. We're not losing our men charging through city streets and getting picked off one by one. Bring in the artillery. So I totally get why they would have resorted to that.
And the British claimed that when cornered, the rebels would throw away their weapons and pretend to be civilians, even going so far as to use women as shields. Now, this may have been true, or it may have simply been a justification to excuse what happened next.
And I'll say this, whenever, and we talk about this all the time, when you're dealing with conflicting sources, when you're dealing with sources, period, it's always important to ask a bunch of questions. Like, number one, are they in a position to know this information? Like, did they witness it firsthand, or are they hearing it from someone else? What is their bias? What is their agenda? So if you've got British soldiers saying they were using these people as human shields, it doesn't mean you automatically dismiss it and say it's not true, but you have to say, you know what, if they killed some civilians, that's probably what they would say, is that they were using them as human shields. And the other side would say, well, we definitely weren't doing that. They were just murdering civilians. And more than likely, it's somewhere in between. There's probably a mix of both.
Or it might have been both. By Friday, the bloodshed around the four courts still showed no sign of ending. And furious at the casualties sustained, British soldiers burst into a series of homes late Friday night. In an event that became known as the North King Street Massacre, they shot or bayoneted 15 unarmed men, none of whom were taking part in the rising. Such were the realities of rebellion for the nation.
But these are the kinds of things that push people to the other side, people who were in the middle. We talked about this yesterday. People who really didn't take sides suddenly find themselves saying, wow, maybe they're right about the British. Maybe we do need independence. Maybe it's time to take a side. So while this rising itself may not be successful, if it pushes thousands more people to your side, then maybe it's worth it long term.
Nationalists, North King Street was just another example of British brutality, added to centuries of oppression and injustice. And to the British, North King Street was the inevitable result of the nationalists intentionally blurring the lines between soldiers and civilians, thus bringing death and ruination down upon their own people. And as the uprising raged on, many Dubliners actually shared that British view.
And you know, of course they called it the King Street Massacre, just like there was a Boston Massacre in the 1770s in the United States, or what became the United States. And your side is always going to use this as propaganda, right? So look at the evil British and what they did to a bunch of civilians. It's probably more complicated than that. In the case of I don't know the details here, but in the case of the Boston Massacre, it was 5 civilians who were probably in a mob that was threatening armed British soldiers who were protecting the State House, who were throwing things at them, rocks, ice, some of them carrying clubs. They wanted a confrontation. They wanted this to happen so they could turn around and use it, and that's exactly what happened. I'm not saying that that's the case here, but I'm saying that this stuff can be used in a positive way for your side.
They saw the rising as a betrayal of the homeland, especially since hundreds of thousands of Irishmen, including Irish nationalists, were giving their lives in the struggle overseas against Imperial Germany. But regardless, as the brutal fighting near the four courts dragged on, it quickly became clear that it would not be the bloodiest engagement that day. Northumberland Road, Dublin, Ireland, that same day. A column of British soldiers march along the street through a leafy, well-to-do part of Dublin. They are reinforcements heading into the city. Fresh troops, newly arrived from London, and most just out of basic training. One man, Adjutant Captain Frederick Christian Dietrichson, briefly falls out of ranks to greet a woman and 2 children. They are Dietrichson's wife, son, and daughter. The captain had sent for them from London, moving them to Ireland in hopes to avoid the threat of German Zeppelin bombings. He could have never imagined an even greater danger awaited them here.
So what he's talking about there with the Zeppelin bombings is the Zeppelins, think Hindenburg. We call them blimps here in America now. They're flying them over the channel and they're bombing cities. I mean, they're bombing Scotland. They're bombing England. They're dropping these bombs, and it's kind of a World War I version of the Blitz that's going to happen in World War II. It's not nearly to the level, but it's something new in warfare. Airplanes have only existed for like 10 years. Now, these aren't airplanes, but the idea of air power in warfare is a very new thing. So understandable for him to want to move his family away from that, much like people did in World War II, moving their families out of the cities.
But for now, he's relieved to see that his family is safe. And they, for their part, will never see him again. Just a few minutes later, Dietrichson and 9 other soldiers die in a rebel ambush not far from Mount Street Bridge. Caught in the open, the inexperienced soldiers suffer terrible losses, and rather than retreat, they're ordered to press on. So they did, marching directly into a disaster. At Mount Street Bridge, spanning the Grand Canal, those British reinforcements struggled against a small detachment of dug-in rebels. Ill-equipped and inexperienced, they suffered 216 casualties, accounting for 2/3 of all of the British Army losses during the Rising. In addition, around 20 civilians were also killed or wounded while trying to help fallen British soldiers caught in the open. Elsewhere, at the
That is to say, nobody's clean in all of this, right? Both sides have killed civilians. Both sides have done things that shouldn't be praised. This is the kind of ugliness that happens, especially in what you can call a civil war in this case, a revolution, an attempted revolution. Things get ugly, and people die in the crossfire. Brutal.
Mendicity Institution charity building, 26 Irish volunteers made a stand against repeated British assaults. Enduring sniper fire and a hail of bullets from machine guns, the outpost continued to resist until they ran out of ammunition. And this was just one of many similar incidents across the city. For the nationalists fighting from the Northumberland Hotel to the South Dublin Union, all of whom had resolved to take up arms despite the odds, this rising was the ultimate moment of reckoning, the struggle they believed they had inherited from their forefathers. Further west, at the South Dublin Union, more brutal close combat played out. The fighting went from building to building, and room to room, as the British attempted to pry the rebels from their positions. Some of the structures in the complex were taken, but others remained in the hands of the volunteers. The rebels fought for every inch, and when one nationalist officer was severely wounded, he ordered his men to leave him behind, while he continued to fight on, alone, armed only with his pistol. Though frontal assaults were the order of the day in some parts of the city, in others, the nationalists were instead subjected to ranged bombardment. British artillery opened fire on Wednesday from Trinity College and Phibsborough, supported by a gunboat that had sailed up the River Liffey. The relentless shelling killed volunteers and civilians alike and kept most of the rebels pinned down. In a matter of days, the grand architecture of several Dublin neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, outside Dublin, counter orders had ensured that most of the Irish volunteers beyond the city stayed at home. Others mustered but didn't engage in combat. And in Cork, Roman Catholic clergy successfully persuaded the volunteers to surrender their weapons to the British Army. Though elsewhere, a few chose to ignore their directives.
So what you're dealing with then is you're dealing with a very disjointed, not well coordinated rising that's happening. And this is the problem anytime you're dealing with going up against a formidable, well-supplied, well-equipped, well-led force like the British Army. You can't really match them in terms of organization and leadership. And you're seeing the failing of that here, where you've got some people rising up and others being talked into not rising, or maybe changing their mind. And it's just, it needed to go perfectly. It needed everything to go in their way. They needed people to rise up. That didn't happen. They didn't even get all the people who were already signed up to be a part of this to rise up the way that they should. So it was doomed to fail.
And fight anyway. The largest entanglement outside Dublin occurred to the north of the city, where an Irish volunteer battalion convinced a string of Royal Irish Constabulary stations to surrender. The last one did so only after a 5-hour-long firefight that left 8 policemen and 5 volunteers dead. Despite this, there was still next to no support for the uprising from the general Irish populace. So the success or failure of the rising would ultimately hinge on the events playing out in Dublin. Sackville Street, April 29th, 1916. The General Post Office is in flames, its ruins blazing, as a pale of black smoke joins the dozens of smudges already blotting the Dublin skyline. However, the structure is mercifully abandoned. The nationalist leadership who fought from it have evacuated at the last minute, tunneling through walls to escape the all-consuming fire. They set up a new command post in nearby Moore Street. Every one of them, from the newest volunteer right up the chain of command to Pierce himself, is exhausted. Some are wounded, some dying. James Connolly has taken a bullet to the leg. Food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies, all of it is almost gone.
Now they're done.
The volunteers called, but Ireland has not answered. They have no more left to give. Pierce knows that...
And what's that do to you psychologically, right? When you believe in your cause and you are willing to die for it, you obviously are all in, heart, soul, spirit. And you're convinced that other people will rise up if they are just led, if they're just inspired. And then when you do this and you start watching the guys that you've worked toward this with die around you, and the rising doesn't happen, that's got to be devastating to you psychologically. And I wonder how they dealt with that.
The cost to the city has already been appalling, and fighting to the death will only lead to more civilian casualties. So reluctantly, he orders his men to lay down their arms and sends a message to the British asking for terms. The Easter Rising is over. Pierce, Connolly, and the other leaders of the uprising in Dublin are taken into captivity. It takes a few days for the surrender orders to reach the various pockets of rebel resistance, and after the high emotion and intense combat, many are reluctant to give up their weapons.
And I will say this, the decision to surrender in that situation, because you see all the death that's happening, you got to say it's kind of selfless if you're one of the leaders, because you have to know the chances are really good that they're going to execute you. But you're probably counting on the fact, well, maybe they'll execute me, but that doesn't mean they'll execute everybody else. And maybe I'm still saving lives in the end.
This had been their chance, their moment to change the history of their country and avenge centuries of oppression. And yet, they'd failed. When the last of them finally submitted, the cost of the uprising became clear. At the final count, 126 British soldiers, including 35 from Irish regiments, had been killed along with 17 policemen, and among the nationalists, 66 had died. But the greatest number of dead were the civilians, 260 in all, with thousands more wounded. More
civilians died than all of the combatants combined. You're looking at 143, 209 total between police, British Army, and Irish nationalists, but it's the civilians who pay, and that's usually the way it is.
Parts of Dublin were in ruins from shelling, and smoke continued to cloud the sky for days. But while the fighting may have been over, the dying hadn't yet run its course. Because in defeat, the Easter Rising and the British response to it would serve as a fault line that would break Ireland apart. One of the main reasons...
All right, well, I think we've got one more episode to go. So we'll deal with that tomorrow. I'm actually going to record it later today because my wife and I are off to Denver tomorrow. Also be posting tomorrow some announcements concerning the trip to Denver and also when you can expect for a stream to talk about my recent trip to Europe. So all of that's coming. If you'd hit that like button, leave a comment, I'd appreciate it. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.